Between 2600 and 2500 BC, on the edge of the Sahara, thousands of skilled workers carved and hauled massive stones without wheels, iron, or machines, building monuments so precise they still puzzle engineers today. Life was hot, dangerous, and exhausting, but these teams lived in organized worker villages and accomplished the impossible. Here's what it was really like to build a pyramid. If these help you relax, a like or subscribe would be awesome. And drop your location and time. I love seeing people listening from places like Brazil, India, and Canada, all on one video. All right, get comfortable.
Of all the mysteries humanity has cooked up over the centuries, disappearing civilizations, ancient curses, where did I put my keys? Nothing has lingered in the public imagination quite like the pyramids. These colossal, desert-dominating triangles of limestone have been sitting there for over 4,000 years, minding their own business. And yet modern people still look at them and say, nope, humans didn't do that, impossible. Bring me the aliens. It's a question that refuses to die because the pyramids themselves refuse to be subtle. They are unapologetically gigantic. They are mathematically precise. They are older than your entire family tree, your country, your language, and possibly your sense of fashion. They radiate the energy of something that should not be possible, like a cat obeying instructions or a grocery cart with all four wheels functioning. Stand at the base of the Great Pyramid and look up. The thing is so huge it makes skyscrapers insecure. And unlike modern skyscrapers, it was not built using computer models, cranes, or a construction crew wearing reflective vests and arguing about lunch breaks. It was built with stone tools, sweat, organisation, and a level of ancient stubbornness that deserves a global award. And this is precisely why the big question sticks around. How did ancient Egyptians build something this massive without modern technology? It haunts people. It taunts people. It lurks in documentaries narrated by men with dramatic voices who refuse to speak at a normal volume. Every year, someone somewhere releases a new theory. Ramps, spirals, water flotation, giants, sound levitation, or the ever-popular explanation, something, forgotten civilization. Because apparently it's easier for some people to believe in an ancient, secret, hyper-advanced society that vanished without a trace than to accept that Egyptians were just good at their jobs. But here's the thing. The pyramids weren't miracles, and they weren't cosmic mysteries. They were engineering. Brilliant, organised, relentless engineering, powered by tens of thousands of skilled workers who probably just wanted their wages, their bread rations, and a day off that never came. The pyramids have become symbols of mystery, but of the people who built them, they were construction projects. Massive ones, yes. Difficult ones, definitely. But not magical. Just boss wants a giant stone triangle, so we're making a giant stone triangle. So the real question is not whether humans built the pyramids, it's how ancient Egyptians pulled off one of the greatest engineering achievements in human history, one perfectly placed block at a time. Let's clear up the biggest historical misconception right away. The pyramids were not built by enslaved people, being whipped under the desert sun by a villainous overseer who looked suspiciously like he belonged in a badly researched Hollywood movie. That version of history survives only because filmmakers love dramatic scenery, and because someone somewhere once said this is close enough, and thousands of people just went along with it. The truth is far more surprising and honestly much more wholesome. The pyramids were built by paid Egyptian workers. Yes, paid as in wages, food rations, housing, time off, medical care, and work crews with supervisors who actually wrote performance reports on pottery shards. It was less slavery and more massive national construction project run by people who were both committed and slightly terrified of disappointing the pharaoh. These workers weren't random citizens dragged off the street. They were specialists, quarrymen, engineers, architects, tool makers, bakers, brewers, rope makers, and yes, even professional stone haulers with thighs strong enough to crush a chariot. Many came from farming families. The Nile's flood season made farming impossible for part of the year. So instead of sitting at home complaining about the weather like modern people, they joined rotating labour teams called gangs. Each gang had names like the Friends of Khufu, which is adorable until you remember the friend in question was building a pyramid the size of a small mountain. Archaeologists also discovered worker villages near the pyramids. Entire neighbourhoods with bakeries, barracks, breweries, kitchens and medical facilities. There were even cemeteries for workers who died during the project, buried with honours. No one builds a cemetery for enslaved labourers. They build one for people they respect. And let's not forget the beer. Workers received rations of bread, onions and enough beer per day to keep morale high and mild dehydration at bay. This wasn't cheap beer either. It was ancient Egypt's version of an energy drink. Thick, nutritious, and strong enough to make you believe you could actually move a 50-ton stone block. Were conditions easy? Absolutely not. Imagine working construction in a desert wearing linen, hauling limestone under a sun that could melt your hopes. But these weren't disposable labourers. They were skilled, valued, and essential workers in the largest building project on Earth. So no, the pyramids weren't built by slaves. They were built by teams of hard-working Egyptians who probably wondered every day why the pharaoh couldn't have chosen a smaller tomb. If you picture ancient Egyptian architects as men in linen skirts, casually doodling triangle shapes in the sand until something pyramidish emerges, prepare to have your worldview professionally adjusted. The people who designed the pyramids were not guessing. They were not improvising. They were not vibing their way to world wonders. They were mathematical assassins. These planners, the scribes, surveyors, architects and overseers were the elite nerd squad of ancient Egypt. Forget Hogwarts. This was Pappy Warts, where students studied geometry, measurements, astronomy, logistics, and how to keep 2,000 workers from wandering off to take a nap in the shade. The Egyptians did not use advanced calculators or pocket lasers. They used ropes, shadows, poles, and more geometry than your high school teacher ever hoped you'd remember. Their ropes had knots spaced at precise intervals to measure distances, angles, and layout grids. Meanwhile, your rope at home is tangled, embarrassing, and probably being used as a clothesline. Aligning the Great Pyramid alone required an almost disrespectful level of precision. We're talking alignment to the cardinal directions so accurate that modern surveyors get nervous. Meanwhile, the Egyptians achieved this with nothing but stargazing and sheer confidence. They tracked the movement of circumpolar stars, determined true north through celestial observations, and then said, "Yes, this is fine," as if they hadn't just performed divine-level mathematics with a stick. The planners also solved the small issue of building something huge that wouldn't collapse. They used slope ratios, load distribution, internal chambers, relieving blocks, and the basic architectural principle of if this falls down, the pharaoh will be extremely unhappy. So, let's not do that. They also mapped out worker housing, water distribution, food supply, tool management, stone logistics, and ramp construction. Imagine designing a city, a supply chain, a monument, and a very large triangle all at once. Then being told, you must also finish it before the pharaoh finishes his reign and starts haunting you for being late. Even the placement of the pyramids was intentional. They built on bedrock for stability near the Nile for transportation, and close to quarries to avoid dragging limestone from the opposite side of the planet. Every decision was calculated, deliberate, and deeply not aligned with the popular idea that they just stacked rocks. These were not random desert triangles. They were planned with brilliance, discipline, and just enough mathematical charisma to survive thousands of years. The pyramids aren't mysteries of construction. They're monuments to ancient Egypt's nerds, and those nerds were unstoppable. If you want to understand how the pyramids were built, you must begin where ancient Egyptian dreams went to die. The quarries. Because before a single block ever touched a ramp, before any engineer with suspiciously good geometry skills drew a single perfect angle, somebody had to cut tens of thousands of stones out of solid bedrock. And trust me, this was not the glamorous part of pyramid construction. This was the welcome to the Bronze Age. Here is your hammer. Go cry in the heat part. Most of the limestone for the Great Pyramid came from a quarry that was inconveniently right next to the pyramid site. This was considered lucky, which tells you everything you need to know about ancient construction standards. But even with that short distance, the real challenge was carving gigantic blocks out of rock using none of the tools humans desperately want them to have. No iron saws, no power tools, no divine laser cutters from the star Sirius, just copper chisels, stone hammers, and the sheer determination of thousands of workers who are probably trying not to think too hard about the rest of their workday. Egyptian quarrying sounded simple in theory. Chisel lines, pound wedges, crack stone, remove block. Hope your supervisor doesn't say, actually we need 50 more by noon. In reality it was dusty, loud, sweaty, and involved so much sand that some workers probably still had grains in their socks when they reached the afterlife. Copper chisels dulled constantly, so blacksmiths were on standby like overworked pit crews at an ancient NASCAR event. The workers would return every hour with tools blunted by stone harder than their will to live. The blacksmith reheated, reshaped, hammered, handed it back, and watched the cycle repeat. The ancient economy ran on bread, beer, and an unreasonable faith in soft metal. For harder stones, like the granite used for the inner chambers, workers went to Aswan, miles upriver. This is where Egyptian patience reached deity level. They used dolerite pounders, which were basically dense, angry rocks, to crush granite into submission. Imagine beating a countertop with another countertop until one of them gives up. That was the job. Once cut, blocks had to be hauled out of the quarry along prepared tracks. Teams dragged them inch by inch, overseen by men with sticks and enthusiasm, but mostly sticks. The quarries weren't just the beginning of the pyramid, they were the crucible, the place where stone, sweat, and supreme stubbornness fused into the raw material of eternity. Moving multi-ton limestone blocks across the desert sounds like the kind of task that would require heavy machinery, an engineering degree, and at least 3 emotional support beverages. But ancient Egyptians managed it without cranes, trucks, hydraulics, forklifts, or the modern invention known as calling someone else to do it. Instead, They relied on what every great civilization secretly runs on: clever engineering, teamwork, and a staggering amount of stubbornness. Let's start with the basics. The blocks did not get rolled on giant wooden logs, contrary to every schoolbook illustration ever. Why? Because Egypt had about 7 trees total, all of which were busy being sacred, royal, or decorative. The idea of wasting precious wood on rolling stones the size of bedrooms was about as likely as Pharaoh issuing free dental care. So, the Egyptians used sledges, giant wooden sleds onto which the stone blocks were loaded. Workers pulled them using thick ropes, forming long coordinated teams. And by coordinated, I mean dozens of men shouting at each other while attempting to move something heavier than their collective hopes and dreams. But the trick wasn't the pulling, it was the sand. Dry sand is terrible for dragging heavy objects. Your sledge sinks, friction skyrockets, and suddenly everything is terrible and everyone wants to go home. So the Egyptians did something genius. They watered the sand. Yes, real science. When you sprinkle water onto loose sand, the grains clump together, reducing friction dramatically. Suddenly the sledge glides across the surface like a smooth, ancient cheat code. This wasn't speculation. It's depicted in actual paintings. One worker is always shown pouring water in front of the sledge, looking like he's doing the ancient equivalent of maintenance, while everyone else does the pulling. For longer distances they used river barges. Massive stone blocks were floated up or down the Nile on wooden boats so sturdy they might as well have signed sponsorship deals. Teams loaded stones at quarry docks, sailed them to nearby ramps, and unloaded them via controlled chaos. Then came the desert hauling. Hauling that required rhythmic pulling, coordinated chanting, and enough rope tension to make a modern safety inspector spontaneously combust. At no point did Egyptians shrug and say, "This is too hard, let's quit." Instead, they refined the process over generations, turning stone transport into a national sport. Not for glory, not for fun, but because they had pyramids to build and absolutely no interest in disappointing a pharaoh who believed his afterlife depended on punctual construction. If you've ever climbed a stairmaster at the gym and thought, "Wow, this is torture," allow me to introduce you to the ancient Egyptians, the civilization that created the first and greatest stairmaster system in human history. Except instead of climbing stairs for fitness, they climbed ramps for massive stone-moving doom. And instead of a fan blowing in their face, they had a foreman yelling faster. When people imagine pyramid construction, they picture ropes, sweat, maybe 100 men pulling a block. But what they should be imagining is ramps. Ramps everywhere. Ramps that stretched across the desert like ancient Egyptian traffic jams. Ramps that went straight, sideways, zigzagging, spiralling, and occasionally causing architects to stare at their own sketches like, "This is fine. This is definitely fine." Why ramps? Because ancient Egyptians understood one simple truth. It's easier to drag a stone up a slope than float it into the sky using alien Wi-Fi. There were a few main ramp types, and each one was its own flavour of misery. The straight ramp, the original classic, a long, thick, brutally steep ramp made of mud brick limestone chippings and crushed hopes. This ramp ran directly up one side of the pyramid. It worked well at the beginning until the pyramid got taller and the ramp had to grow so long it could theoretically reach another city. Also, it blocked the face of the pyramid, which architects hated. A prehistoric version of your ruining the aesthetic. The zigzag ramp, like someone looked at the straight ramp, shrugged and said, What if the workers needed more steps? This ramp snaked back and forth up the pyramid sides, turning the job of dragging stone into a cardio workout so intense it should have come with complementary electrolytes. The spiral ramp for the architect who wanted the workers to suffer, but in a more creative way. This ramp wrapped around the pyramid as it rose like a giant sandstone unicorn horn. Great for elevation, terrible for visibility. Block haulers constantly bumped into each other like confused mountain goats. And the real genius, they kept adjusting the ramps as the pyramid grew. Build higher, extend the ramp. Build higher, adjust again. Workers didn't just build the pyramid, they built the thing that allowed them to build the pyramid. It was construction inside construction. A nightmare inside a bigger nightmare. But here's the thing. The ramps worked. Efficient, powerful, simple, brutal, and all without treadmills, lifting belts, or a single gym membership. If you picture the pyramid workforce as a chaotic mob of half-starved slaves collapsing in the sun, while an overseer screams, "Faster, congratulations. You've watched too many Hollywood movies." Reality was far more impressive and honesty more entertaining. The pyramid workforce was organised chaos. Emphasis on organised with just a light drizzle of chaos for a flavour. First, the workers weren't slaves. They were paid labourers, skilled craftsmen, seasonal workers, and farmers picking up side gigs during Nile flooding season. Think of it like ancient Egypt's version of construction workers, unionised farmers, and part-time dads who got bored sitting at home. They even lived in designated workers' towns with bakeries, breweries, clinics, and barracks. Yes, clinics. Because you cannot build a literal mountain of stone without someone smashing a finger every 14 minutes. These workers were divided into teams called gangs, each proudly naming themselves things like the Friends of Khufu or the Drunk but Determined Crew. Names that sound suspiciously like modern intramural sports teams. Every gang had its own hierarchy, supervisors, team leads, and scribes tracking who did what. Imagine someone spending 8 hours a day writing. Amenhotep moved 3 blocks. Kenru moved 2 blocks and then complained about his back. They had cooks preparing tens of thousands of loaves of bread per day, brewers making vats of beer, and butchers handling cattle so regularly that the butcher's area looked like a Bronze Age supermarket without refrigeration. Beer, by the way, was part of the workers' daily ration. Hydration plus morale. The ancient Egyptians basically invented the concept of drink on the job. Workers came in different tiers. You had skilled stonecutters, the elite specialists, haulers, the muscle who dragged blocks with ropes, riggers who coordinated lifts and pulls, water carriers whose job was hydrating literally everyone and smoothing sand for sledges, and finally the supervisors whose job was pointing dramatically and saying, "Lift it, no, higher." Despite the scale, the system functioned astonishingly well. Workers rotated shifts, teams competed for efficiency, injuries were treated. They had medical records showing healed bones and long-term care. This was not a disposable workforce. This was a national treasure of manpower, logistics, and questionable ancient motivational speeches. Was it exhausting? Absolutely. Was it chaotic? Of course. But it was organised chaos, the kind that builds a monument so massive people thousands of years later insist it must have been aliens. The workers didn't just build pyramids, they built one of history's greatest case studies in teamwork. You don't pull multi-ton limestone blocks across the desert on an empty stomach. The ancient Egyptians understood this deeply, perhaps too deeply. because the pyramid builders were fueled by a diet that can only be described as carbs, more carbs, onions, and enough beer to stun a camel. Let's start with bread, the backbone of the ancient Egyptian food pyramid, which ironically powered the actual pyramids. Workers received rations of thick, heavy loaves that were basically ancient protein bars, if protein bars were made of wheat, grit, and enough calories to keep a human dragging stones from sunrise to sunset. This bread wasn't soft or fluffy. It was durable, indestructible. Some archaeologists have found bread so hard it could probably become a construction material. Then we have onions, mountains of onions, entire fields dedicated to fueling workers with this pungent miracle bulb. Why onions? Because they were cheap, grown everywhere, and in the Egyptian worldview, full of spiritual protection. And also because onions are dense in calories and electrolytes, turning each worker into a surprisingly efficient if extremely fragrant labour machine. Next up, dried fish, salty, chewy, and stored in quantities that suggest the Nile was providing an all-you-can-eat buffet. This fish delivered protein for muscle repair, and considering these workers were essentially human forklifts, muscle repair was not optional. Some modern reconstructions estimate that the average pyramid labourer burned over 4,000 calories a day. The fish didn't taste great, but it kept people alive long enough to keep pulling. And then we reached the star of the menu, the liquid MVP, the fuel that made everything possible. Beer. Not modern, crisp, refreshing beer. No, ancient Egyptian beer was thick, bready and nutritious, more like a drinkable loaf than a beverage, and workers consumed an estimated 4 litres per person per day. Hydration? Yes. Nutrition? Definitely. Motivation? Questionable, but probably yes. Look, we can't prove the pyramids were built by tipsy workers, but we can't rule it out either. Imagine hauling a stone block the size of a small car after your 3rd litre of breakfast beer. Suddenly, it makes sense why ancient Egyptians depicted their gods with animal heads. After enough ancient beer, everything probably looked like that. Despite the jokes, this diet was carefully engineered. High calories, high carbs, enough salts to survive the heat, and constant liquid intake. It was the world's first state-sponsored mass catering program, a prehistoric cafeteria designed to keep thousands of workers constructing the most iconic stone structures on Earth. Bread, onions, fish and beer. Not glamorous, not elegant, but undeniably effective. Here's where the pyramids go from impressive engineering project to, okay, now you're just showing off. Because the Great Pyramid isn't just big, it isn't just old, it is insanely precise. So precise that even modern engineers sometimes stare at it, like it just insulted their degree. Let's start with the alignment. The Great Pyramid is oriented to true north with an accuracy so absurd that you'd think the builders had access to a satellite, a laser, and a very patient surveyor. But no, they had sticks, string, and the sky. And yet they aligned the entire structure within a fraction of a degree of the planet's actual north-south axis. Today we have compasses, GPS and apps that tell you which direction to face while cooking noodles. They had the sun and an attitude of close enough. Except their close turned out to be mathematically ridiculous. Then there's the levelling. The base of the Great Pyramid sits on a platform so perfectly flat that it makes modern construction sites look like someone eyeballed everything after lunch. Across a surface the size of several football fields, the entire base varies in height by less than the width of your thumb. Not bad for people without bulldozers, lasers, or the ability to yell, "We're off level," while waving a digital level around. And the sides, oh the sides, each one is almost exactly the same length. We're talking variations in millim. This is the kind of precision you expect from a Swiss watchmaker, not a civilization that carved stone with copper chisels and used geometry taught by priests who also performed embalming on weekends. How did they do it? Very carefully, painstakingly, with a level of teamwork and patience that absolutely no modern group project possesses. They used ropes, grids, plumb bobs, water trenches, the movement of the stars, and good old-fashioned stubbornness. When something wasn't right, they fixed it. When a block didn't align, they adjusted it. No shortcuts, no good enough. No, we'll fix it in post-production. And perhaps the funniest part, none of this was done for tourists, future archaeologists, or the approval of conspiracy theorists. They weren't trying to impress us. They built with this level of precision because their religion demanded perfection, and because no one wanted to be the guy responsible for the slightly crooked pyramid. So yes, the Great Pyramid's precision seems impossible, but the builders weren't aiming for possible. They were aiming for eternal, and they hit the mark. Moving the stone blocks to the pyramid was impressive, but placing them, that was where ancient Egyptian engineering truly said, "All right, everyone, let's get ridiculous." Once the stones arrived at the construction site, scraped across desert sledges, dragged by teams of workers, occasionally yelled at by supervisors who took their job way too seriously, the next challenge began. Lifting multi-ton blocks up an ever-growing staircase of limestone. And remember, no pulleys, no cranes, no forklifts driven by a guy named Dave. Just levers, teamwork, and a level of determination fueled largely by beer and spite. The first tool in their arsenal, the lever, a simple wooden beam wedged under the edge of a block and pulled downward to lift it upward. The same principle used today for opening stubborn jars, flipping tables dramatically, or removing something you regret from under the fridge. Workers wedged the lever under the stone, lifted it a few centimes, slid small stones underneath, then repeated the process. Lift, wedge, lift, wedge. The ancient equivalent of someone tapping snooze repeatedly, except much heavier and without the promise of sleep. Next came the sledges, used not only for horizontal dragging, but also for short, controlled vertical adjustments. Teams positioned the block at the edge of the ramp or pyramid layer, then relied on coordinated pulling, guiding ropes, and a spiritual amount of grunting. Supervisors stood nearby, offering helpful commentary like, "Pull harder, no, harder," and "Are you even trying?" The stones didn't magically click into position. They were coaxed like stubborn cats. Each block was adjusted with smaller stones acting as temporary supports, nudged gently with wooden mallets, and aligned with string grids stretched across the entire pyramid structure. And by string grids, we mean one worker holding a rope and squinting intensely while insisting he was perfectly straight. The most astonishing part, these blocks fit together with such tight precision that not even a knife blade can slip between them today. That means every time a block was slightly crooked, a team of exhausted workers had to adjust it again and again until the overseer said, "Yes, that'll do," or gave up pretending he could tell the difference. And as the pyramid grew taller, so did the difficulty. Workers hauled stones up ramps, lifted them into place, and adjusted them under brutal sun, swirling dust, and desert heat that absolutely did not care for their well-being. The fact that this process was repeated millions of times is the real miracle. Not aliens, not lost super technology, just pure human strength, geometry, and the unwavering ancient Egyptian commitment to saying higher. If the outside of the pyramids is impressive, the inside is where ancient Egyptian architects basically leaned over to the future and whispered, "Good luck figuring this out." Because while most people imagine pyramids as giant stone triangles with nothing going on inside, the truth is the opposite. They're stuffed with corridors, chambers, shafts, hidden passageways, and architectural decisions that scream. We're geniuses, but also slightly dramatic. Let's start with the King's Chamber, a room built entirely out of massive granite blocks quarried from Aswan sitting more than 500 metres away. Each granite beam weighs between 50 and 80 tons, which is roughly the size of a small whale or a large argument, and somehow Egyptians hauled them across the country up ramps and into the centre of the pyramid without cranes, forklifts, or a group chat labelled Granite Squad. How did they do it? With ramps, platforms, and an attitude of relentless optimism. They likely created angled ramps that spiralled or zigzagged upward inside the structure. These ramps allowed workers to drag the beams horizontally rather than lifting them vertically, which is good because lifting an 80-ton block straight up is the kind of thing that makes engineers lie down and rethink their life choices. Once inside the chamber area, the real magic happened. Using levers, rollers, sledges, and a whole lot of shouting, teams manoeuvred each granite block into place with millimetre-level precision. No hydraulics, no steel, just physics, determination, and the ancient Egyptian version of co-worker pressure. But the crowning achievement, the thing that makes modern engineers mutter, "Okay, that's actually insane," is the system of relieving chambers above the King's Chamber. These stacked rooms, separated by massive stone beams, redistributed the weight of the pyramid so the chamber wouldn't collapse under the millions of tons of stone above it. It's basically an ancient shock absorber system, or the world's first "this building shall not crush the pharaoh" insurance policy. The brilliance is that the Egyptians didn't just build a chamber. They built a chamber with layers of architectural armour. Each relieving chamber absorbed stress, diverted pressure, and kept the ceiling from doing the one thing a ceiling should never do, fall. So, yes, ancient Egyptians mastered structural load distribution long before anyone walked into an engineering lecture and heard the phrase compressive stress. These people didn't just build monuments, they built puzzles that modern experts still argue about. And the best part, they made it look easy. If you imagine pyramid builders living in tents, chewing on sand and collapsing in the desert while someone with eyeliner shouts orders, please toss that image directly into the Nile. The actual daily life around the Giza construction area looked more like a bustling industrial town. Ancient, dusty, slightly chaotic, but surprisingly well managed. Workers didn't live in the middle of nowhere. They lived in a purpose-built workers' village, complete with straight streets, bakeries, breweries, kitchens, barracks, storage houses, and even neighbourhoods. It was the Bronze Age version of a company town, just with more sun and fewer vacation days. The bakeries alone were producing bread on an industrial scale. We're talking mountains of dough. Archaeologists found massive communal ovens so blackened from use, they looked like they'd been personally scorched by Ra himself. And the bread wasn't the dainty artisan loaf you see on Instagram. This was dense brick-like calorie bomb bread designed to fuel a human engine dragging multi-ton-on stones uphill. And the beer, let's just say OSHA would have had concerns. Workers drank around 4 litres of beer per day, which is absolutely a health hazard in the modern world, but was considered hydration with benefits in ancient Egypt. The beer was thick, nutritious, and mildly alcoholic. The perfect combination for a civilization that built wonders and probably had incredible tolerance. The workers' village also had butcheries where cattle, sheep and goats were processed to feed the massive workforce. Ancient Egyptians weren't starving on the job. They were eating meat, onions, fish, bread and enough carbs to power the entire Philadelphia Eagles' offensive line. And then there's the medical care. Yes, real medical care. Archaeologists found skeletons with bone fractures that healed perfectly straight, which means someone at the site was basically acting as an ancient orthopedic surgeon. People with broken legs and arms weren't thrown aside. They were treated, rested, and returned to work once healed, which is more than certain modern employers can claim. The village wasn't just efficient, it was social. Workers ate together, slept in shared quarters, joked, argued, exchanged gossip, and almost certainly complained about supervisors, just like every worksite in human history. The walls even have graffiti. Workers carving team names like the Friends of Khufu, which sounds less like a labour crew and more like an ancient bowling league. Daily life wasn't glamorous, but it wasn't miserable either. It was organised, structured, human, and it powered the greatest construction project the world has ever seen. If you came here expecting ancient Egyptians to whip out laser cutters, diamond saws, or some mysterious alien toolkit shaped like a glowing USB stick, I regret to inform you, their tools were hilariously simple. So simple, in fact, that if you handed them to a modern construction worker, he would stare at you, stare at the tool, and then file an HR complaint. But here's the twist. The Egyptians didn't need advanced technology. Their brilliance came not from what they used, but how they used it. Their toolkit included copper chisels, wooden mallets, stone pounders, wooden sledges, and diorite balls, which, in case you're not familiar with ancient geology, are basically fist-sized cannonballs made of a rock tougher than a bad-tiered camel. These diorite pounders were used to bash limestone blocks into shape. Not carve, not shave, bash full force day after day until the stone surrendered out of sheer exhaustion. Copper chisels were softer than the stone they were hitting, meaning they had to be constantly resharpened. Imagine being a pyramid worker, chiseling for 10 minutes, and then walking all the way back to the blacksmith like, "Hey, yeah, it's dull again." And the blacksmith sighs because he has sharpened that exact chisel approximately 19,000 times this month. Wooden mallets were used for striking the chisels. Simple, effective, and perfect for building pyramids and venting workplace frustration. Every mallet swing doubled as therapy. Every chisel strike whispered, "This pharaoh better appreciate this." Then we have the stone pounders. These were used by the more enthusiastic workers. Their job, smash, just smash, smash the limestone blocks until they achieved the perfect shape. Archaeologists have found piles of shattered diorite balls, meaning some workers really went for it. The ancient equivalent of someone hitting the gym and deciding every day is arm day. But the true genius wasn't the tool itself, it was the method. Egyptians used grids, red ochre guidelines, plumb lines made from string, and levels based on water trenches. With nothing but simple geometry, good eyesight, and a terrifying amount of patience, they achieved the accuracy today's contractors would blame on the machine doing most of the work. Their tools were humble, their techniques were elegant, their craftsmanship was legendary. They didn't need alien tech. They had skill, discipline, and the collective determination to complete the pharaoh's enormous cosmic flex. At some point in this story, a very reasonable question pops into the mind. Why? Why build something this big? Why drag millions of stone blocks across blistering desert heat? Why pour decades of national effort into a triangular mountain that does not, in fact, have a gift shop? Well, ancient Egypt had several answers, and depending on which one you focus on, the pyramids start to look either spiritual, political, or like the world's earliest recorded case of my dynasty is bigger than your dynasty. First, religion. The ancient Egyptian afterlife was not a casual concept. It was a full-time high-budget production, and the pharaoh was the star of the show. The pyramid wasn't just a tomb, it was a resurrection machine, a giant stone launch pad meant to shoot the king's soul upward toward the heavens, or at least give it a slope to climb. The shape itself symbolised the rays of the sun guiding the pharaoh's spirit to join the gods. Think of it as spiritual infrastructure. Second, politics. You must remember, pharaohs were not elected officials. They were absolute rulers with unlimited ambition and a sincere fear of being forgotten. A pyramid was not just a building, it was a message. It said, "My kingship is eternal. My power is unmatched. Please stop plotting against me. I literally built a mountain." Constructing a pyramid announced to rival elites, citizens and neighbouring states that the pharaoh had total control over labour, resources, logistics and geology. It was the ancient equivalent of a political billboard, except instead of being 20 feet tall, it was 480 feet tall and visible from orbit. Third, legacy and flexing. Let's be honest, pharaohs liked showing off. If you ruled a superpower with divine status and a god complex, wouldn't you commission something absurdly large? The Great Pyramid wasn't just a tomb, it was a statement piece, a monument that said, "Look on my works, ye mighty." And maybe bring a measuring tape, because these dimensions are insane. Building colossal pyramids also unified the nation. Workers were fed, housed, paid and cared for. Farmers had employment during the Nile flood season. Industries boomed to supply the construction. The pyramid project wasn't just a tomb, it was a national economic stimulus package disguised as a giant stone triangle. In short, pyramids were religion, politics, legacy, engineering, and the ultimate desert flex. And somehow, thousands of years later, the message still stands, literally. In medieval Europe, the open road was less a pathway between towns and more a hunting ground where danger followed every step. Travellers feared the shadowed woods not because of wild animals, though wolves and boars existed, but because of something far worse, men who behaved exactly like predators. Highwaymen earned the chilling nickname Wolves of the Road for a reason. They operated with patience, strategy and a ruthless understanding of human fear. Every pilgrim bound for a holy shrine, every merchant hauling goods, every messenger carrying sealed letters knew that beyond the city walls, law and civilization grew thin. And where the law thinned, the hunters waited. Medieval authorities simply couldn't control the territory. Patrols were scarce, roads were poorly maintained, and forests were thick enough to swallow entire gangs. Bandits knew the landscape better than soldiers. They mapped ambush points, narrow crossings where a wagon couldn't turn, sharp bends where a rider's sight disappeared, bridges where the sound of hooves covered the rustling of blades, and old Roman roads cracked with overgrowth. travellers might walk for hours without encountering another soul except the one who wanted their purse. What separated these highwaymen from ordinary thieves wasn't just their violence, but their organisation. Some operated alone, but the most feared groups worked in coordinated packs, communicating with whistles or bird calls. Scouts perched in tree branches, watching dust clouds rise from approaching caravans. Others disguised themselves as friendly wanderers, blend in among pilgrims just long enough to identify who carried money, relics, silk, spices, or letters worth ransoming. When the strike came, it was fast and decisive. A fallen tree blocked the path. A rope snapped tight around a horse's legs. A dagger pressed into a throat. The message was always the same: comply or die unseen. Even nobles weren't safe. Many lords travelled with guards, but bandits had spies in taverns who listened for gossip about wealthy caravans leaving at dawn. Some gangs even had informants inside monasteries and markets who traded information for a cut of the loot. If a noble carried coin or fine fabrics, the highwaymen would know before the noble even saddled his horse. In this world, fear ruled the roads. Sleep now. Let yourself sink deeper into that perfect relaxation. Your eyelids are heavy. So heavy it would take too much effort to open them now. Your limbs feel pleasantly weighted, impossible to move even if you wanted to, which you don't. You just want to drift all the way down into deep, restful sleep. That's it. Just let go completely. The day is done. The work is finished. Nothing more required of you now except to rest, to renew, to dream perhaps of different possibilities, different worlds. But for now, just sleep deep and peaceful, easy and calm. Sleep now. Sleep well. Drifting deeper with each breath down and down into perfect, complete rest.